The morning started like any other for Mark Dillard, a city bus driver in Colby Springs, Ohio. Same route, same tired faces, same bridge he crossed every day without thinking twice. But that day, one small choice changed everything. He saw a pale woman at the stop, sweating and holding her chest. She said she needed the hospital, far off his route. Mark hesitated, knowing the rules, never change your path, but he turned anyway. Hours later, when that same bridge collapsed, everyone called him a hero. But Mark knew better. His decision came from guilt, not bravery. Mark Dillard had been driving the number 14 bus for nearly a decade. He liked the quiet mornings before rush hour, the hum of the engine, and the routine that kept him from thinking too much. Every stop, every turn, every face on board felt the same. He followed the rules because rules made him feel safe. In Colby Springs, people saw him as reliable, steady, predictable, forgettable. But behind that calm face, Mark carried something heavy, something that kept him up at night. He didn't tell anyone about the accident that made him fear himself more than the road. Years ago, Mark had made a wrong call during a rainstorm, hitting the brakes too late. A passenger had been thrown forward, left with a permanent limp. The company cleared him, but the guilt didn't fade. Since then, Mark followed protocol like scripture. Never late, never off route, never a decision from the gut. He believed emotion was the enemy of safety. His apartment was silent, his life small, his habits robotic. He told himself that sticking to the rules was his way of staying in control, his penance for that one mistake that changed someone else's life forever. Colby Springs was a fading industrial town. Old factories rusted at the edges of the river, and the bridge that connected both halves of the city groaned under traffic each morning. Still, it was the heart of Mark's route. The bridge was old, but nobody worried. The city council promised repairs every election season, but nothing ever changed. It was the kind of place where everyone just got used to danger because it was familiar. Mark's bus crossed that bridge 6 times a day. To him, it was just another part of the job. Nothing more, nothing less. That Tuesday morning started no different. The sun was barely up, the streets still wet from the night's drizzle. Mark greeted a few regulars, his voice barely above a mumble. He didn't notice anything unusual until he reached the corner of Maple and 3rd. There, sitting on the bench, was a woman he hadn't seen before, pale, trembling, clutching her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. She waved weakly as he stopped. Mark opened the door, and she stumbled inside, her breathing uneven. Something in her eyes made him uneasy, like she was running out of time. The woman could barely speak. Between gasps, she whispered that she needed the hospital. Mark froze. The hospital wasn't on his route. It was miles away in the opposite direction. His instincts screamed to help, but his mind replayed the company rules. Stay on course. He radioed dispatch for guidance, but the reply was curt. Don't deviate. Call an ambulance if needed. He looked at the woman slumped in the seat, face drained of color. He could already hear the ambulance siren in his imagination, coming too late. For the first time in years, Mark's rules didn't feel right. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. The light ahead turned green, and he had to decide. The other passengers started grumbling, checking their watches. His chest tightened. If he turned, he'd break policy, maybe lose his job. If he didn't, this woman might die. He took a deep breath, hit the turn signal, and veered left toward the hospital. The radio crackled instantly, dispatch asking why his bus wasn't tracking. Mark didn't answer. He drove faster than usual, heart pounding, every second heavier than the last. For the first time since the accident, he was driving on instinct again. The passengers began arguing. One man shouted about being late for work, another demanded a refund. Mark barely heard them. The woman's head had fallen back, her breaths shallow. He told himself to focus on the road, but flashes of the past accident played in his mind. He kept his eyes forward, silently promising he wouldn't fail again. The bus jolted over a pothole, and someone cursed loudly behind him. Mark didn't slow down. The hospital was only a few blocks away now. He ignored the chaos, every nerve locked on the woman's fading pulse of life. Dispatch called again, their tone sharper. "Bus 14, why are you off route?" Mark's throat went dry. He pressed the button, lied, and said there was a roadblock ahead. He knew it wouldn't hold up long, but he didn't care. The hospital entrance came into view, red lights flashing, doors sliding open as he pulled to the curb. He jumped from his seat and waved down the nurses. Paramedics rushed out with a stretcher. Within seconds, the woman was surrounded. Mark stood by the bus door, chest heaving, watching as they disappeared inside. For a brief moment, relief hit him. But that relief vanished fast. His phone buzzed with a message from his supervisor, "Report to the depot immediately." He didn't even finish his route. Back at the station, his manager was waiting with folded arms. The conversation was short and cold. Mark was suspended pending review. Company policy had no gray areas. He handed over his ID badge, his hands trembling. Outside, a few passengers were already posting about the detour online. By the time he reached home, headlines were calling him irresponsible. He sat in silence, wondering if saving someone was really the mistake everyone said it was. The next day, the story spread. Local news framed him as the reckless driver who ignored protocol. People online mocked him for playing hero. Mark didn't defend himself. He spent the day staring out his window, the bus depot visible from his apartment. He missed the rhythm of the job, the quiet mornings, the hum of the road, but more than that, he missed feeling useful. His phone stayed silent. No apologies, no support. He thought about appealing the suspension but knew it was pointless. In Colby Springs, rules mattered more than reasons, and nobody cared why he turned that bus. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment he turned the wheel, wondering if he had gone too far. The accident years ago had taught him to never trust his gut, and now it had cost him everything again. He felt trapped between guilt and relief. He didn't know if the woman survived or not. The silence from the hospital only made it worse. He started doubting his own judgment all over again, asking himself if he'd made that turn to help her, or to feel like a good person again. Either way, the damage was already done. The following morning, Mark woke to his phone vibrating non-stop. Missed calls, messages, alerts. He turned on the TV and froze. The image on the screen showed the Colby Bridge. His bridge collapsed into the river. Cars were submerged. Emergency lights flashed across the water. Reporters said it had happened just minutes after his usual scheduled crossing. Mark sat motionless, heart pounding in his chest. His bus would have been right there. Every passenger he carried could have died. He turned off the TV, hands shaking, trying to process the impossible coincidence that had just rewritten his life overnight. By noon, the same reporters who called him reckless were now calling him a miracle worker. Driver's split-second decision saves dozens, one headline read. Strangers left flowers outside the depot. His neighbors stopped him in the hallway to thank him. The company lifted his suspension within hours, pretending they'd always supported him. Mark stood in the middle of it all. Numb. He didn't feel like a hero. He hadn't known the bridge would collapse. His turn wasn't courage. It was guilt. He wondered how people could cheer for a man who broke a rule by accident and got lucky. City officials launched an investigation into the collapse. Old inspection reports surfaced, revealing the bridge had been marked unsafe for years. Budget delays, ignored warnings. It was all preventable. Mark couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd been to disaster. He started driving again, but every turn felt heavy. The faces of his passengers looked different now, grateful but distant. He didn't see admiration in their eyes, only relief. Everyone in Colby Springs wanted to move on, but Mark couldn't. He felt like he was living in someone else's story, a hero made from a mistake he never meant to make. Weeks later, Mark received a letter from the hospital. The woman had survived and wanted to meet him. He hesitated but went. She looked fragile, but calm, sitting by the window. She thanked him softly for what he'd done. Mark nodded, unsure what to say. But something about her tone felt off, almost guarded. She didn't act surprised about the bridge collapse. Her eyes carried a knowing look that unsettled him. When he asked if she'd known anything about it, she paused just a little too long before saying no. The doubt started creeping back into his mind. The next day, Mark couldn't stop thinking about her reaction. He replayed her words, her eyes, that small hesitation. He decided to search her name online, finding barely anything, no social media, no local records. But one article from years ago caught his eye, a bridge maintenance protest photo. There she was, holding a sign about safety reports being ignored. Her husband's name was in the caption, one of the victims of a past bridge accident. Mark's stomach dropped. She hadn't just needed a ride, she had known exactly which bus to board and what route would cross that bridge. The realization stunned him. She had planned it. She had forced him to break the rules and take a different road. It wasn't a coincidence at all. He wanted to confront her, but part of him admired her. She had saved lives through him, using his guilt to guide her plan. Mark felt conflicted. Was she manipulating him, or was she saving people in the only way she could? The next time he visited her, she didn't deny it. She simply said the city ignored her warnings, and this was the only way to make them listen. Then she asked him to keep it secret. Mark didn't know what to do. The company had already turned him into a poster boy for safety awareness, while the real hero was being forgotten in a hospital bed. The mayor praised him, cameras flashing, people cheering. Every word of gratitude felt wrong. He thought about telling the truth. But the woman's eyes haunted him. She didn't want fame. She wanted change. Mark decided to stay quiet for now. But every time he crossed a different bridge, he felt the weight of her secret pressing against his chest, like another unspoken confession waiting to surface. Weeks later, Mark learned the bus company was partnering with the city to rebuild public trust. He was scheduled to speak at a press conference about following safety protocols he'd broken. The hypocrisy made him sick. That night, he visited the hospital again. But her room was empty. The nurse said she'd been discharged and left no forwarding address. He sat in the hallway for a long time, realizing she had vanished the same way she entered his life, suddenly, purposefully. He understood now that she hadn't wanted thanks. She had wanted the truth about the city's neglect to finally surface. Mark couldn't stay silent anymore. He remembered the articles she mentioned, the ignored reports, the outdated inspections. He spent nights digging online, finding proof that the city and the company had both received warnings about the bridge years before the collapse. The files were buried under red tape, but the evidence was there. Mark printed everything and stared at the pile of papers on his table. He had two choices: protect himself and keep his job, or expose the truth and risk everything again. This time he didn't hesitate. He knew which turn he had to take. Mark sent the files anonymously to a journalist who had covered the bridge story. Within days, the news broke wide open. Headlines screamed about ignored maintenance reports, fake safety checks, and officials covering it up. The city went into chaos. Mark watched from his living room as reporters grilled the same people who once called him a hero. The company denied involvement. The mayor stumbled through excuses, and suddenly the truth was everywhere. Nobody knew who leaked the evidence, but Mark didn't care. For the first time, he felt peace. Not pride, just quiet relief that justice had finally turned the corner. Public outrage grew fast. Protests filled the streets. Families of the victims demanded accountability. The woman's name never surfaced, just as she wanted. The spotlight stayed on the corruption she tried to expose, not her sacrifice. Mark stayed out of sight, refusing interviews. He quit the company quietly, walking away from the buses and the noise. He didn't need the uniform anymore to feel like he'd done something right. For the first time since his old accident, he slept soundly, because this time he hadn't just saved lives by chance. He had made the choice on purpose. Months passed. The city rebuilt the bridge stronger than before. A memorial plaque listed the names of those lost and the date of the collapse. Mark visited once, standing by the railing, the sound of the river echoing below. People passed him without recognizing him, and he liked it that way. He didn't need the fame anymore. He placed a single flower by the plaque, not for himself, but for the woman who vanished after saving everyone. Sometimes, doing the right thing didn't come with applause. Sometimes it came with silence, and that silence was its own kind of peace. A local newspaper published a follow-up months later. It mentioned an anonymous source who exposed the negligence and linked it to the same incident that saved the passengers of Bus 14. The piece called The Unknown Source, A Quiet Guardian. Mark read it once, smiled faintly, and folded the page away. He no longer needed recognition. What mattered was that people were finally listening. Roads were being inspected, new safety budgets approved. The woman's message had lived on without her name attached, exactly how she wanted it. Mark realized that sometimes doing the right thing meant letting go completely. Mark eventually moved out of Colby Springs, settling in a smaller nearby town. He took a part-time job, helping the local transit board with safety audits. He wasn't a driver anymore, but his experience mattered. People respected him, not as a hero, but as someone who cared about keeping others safe. It was the first time in years he felt useful without fear. When he looked back, he didn't think of the bridge, or the headlines, or even the applause. He thought about the moment he turned that bus around, the moment he finally stopped running from his own conscience. One quiet afternoon, Mark received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photo, the collapsed bridge under construction again, and scribbled on the back were the words, "Thank you for turning when I couldn't." He knew it was her. He folded the letter carefully, staring out the window at the rebuilt skyline. For once, he didn't feel haunted by the past. He felt connected to something bigger, proof that even broken people can still steer others toward safety if they just take one brave detour. He whispered a quiet thank you and placed the note in his wallet. Years later, Mark found himself on a bus again, but this time as a passenger. The young driver greeted everyone with a tired smile that reminded him of himself. The city skyline shimmered through the window, and as they crossed a brand new bridge, Mark's reflection blended with the moving lights. He thought about how one wrong turn years ago had almost destroyed his life, and one right turn had saved it. He smiled faintly, feeling the road hum beneath him. For the first time, he realized he wasn't afraid of turns anymore. They were how you found new directions. When the bus stopped, Mark stepped off into the golden evening light. He looked back once, watching the bridge stretch behind him, solid and strong. It no longer symbolized guilt or loss. It stood for change. He walked away quietly, not as a hero, not as a man chasing redemption, but as someone who had finally forgiven himself. In a world where most people drive straight ahead, he had learned the power of one detour, one choice that changed everything. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories where one small act changes the entire road ahead.